Thank you, Marcus. Thanks, everyone, as well. Great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to come out here and speak. Probably not great for the air miles and carbon footprint, but it is good to be here, certainly. I wanted to thank everybody who presented yesterday and those that will go on and present later today. I thought yesterday was a really insightful day and I really enjoyed it, so thank you for that. It's the second time I've actually been to the Gabba, or the second event that's brought me here. The last time I came here was quite a few years ago. And as an English cricket fan and employee, it's fair to say that this event's been a lot less painful than the last time I was here, actually. Hopefully the rest of this presentation goes okay and I can maintain that. As Mark has said, I've just been appointed Performance Director for the ECB. But I don't start till next week, actually, so trying to juggle two jobs because in-tray gets full quite quickly. But the stuff I'm going to share in this presentation is going to centre a little bit more on the work that I've done in the last 3 or 4 years, some of the stuff that Marcus talked about there, and my role in that period has been player identification lead for the ECB, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that's involved. When I got asked to present today, I did speak to some of the guys at Fusion, and I wanted to get a bit of a feel for what would be useful for the audience. I wasn't really sure what the room would be like and whether it'd be sort of data analytics heavy or whether there'd be lots of coaches in the room. So I've tried my best to come up with something that I think will be interesting enough for everybody in the room, hopefully, whether you're an analyst, scientist, coach, head of or director of sport. Hopefully there's something in it for you. If not, then I apologise in advance. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes. I'm going to try and leave a bit of time at the end for some questions. Typically when I get going, I get quite passionate and I'll probably over-talk. So feel free to throw questions at me whenever, actually, because I might not leave myself enough time. So if there's anything you want to unpick a little bit further, if there's something you want to have a little argument or debate about, I'm quite keen on that as well. So just stick your hand up and shout at me and we'll get stuck into it. So I'm very happy to do that. So we'll get straight into it. By way of context, I guess my role as player identification lead for the last few years has centred around the men's international pathway, which is pretty much described as that image there. So I'll kind of talk you through the various elements of it. So if we start at the bottom, the Young Lions, which is, for want of a better phrase, it's our under-19 programme. Sorry, bear with me. It's our under-19 programme. And the competitive arm of that is our under-19 team, our international under-19 team. In terms of a talent ID perspective, we scout or officially monitor and scout players from about the age of 15 or 16 through to then competing at under-19 level. Our Lions programme is probably our second team. Some people describe it as the next cabs off the rank. It's quite a tricky team to select for, actually, because in essence you're trying to balance at any given time England's sort of short-term needs, so those next cabs off the rank, England's medium-term needs, but also their long-term needs. So that's quite tricky, actually. So that team ends up being a balance of different types of players with a slightly shorter term, but also a longer-term view. And then, obviously, the England senior team's quite self-explanatory, really. But for those who don't follow cricket too closely, there's obviously the typical cricket quirk of 3 different formats, so Test cricket, 50-over cricket, and T20 cricket. So my role over the last few years has kind of grown and evolved into supporting the identification and selection of players for all 3 of those levels. I've not had any specific women and girls responsibilities, but we do collaborate quite closely. Bit of a history to my role. I started with the ECB in 2011, and my original role was working on our development programme, so the under-19s or the Young Lions, as programme manager. And I got quite fortunate, actually, because in that period when I started, we had a guy called Simon Timpson, who I was just talking about this morning, actually, who he was head of science and medicine at the time and in charge of our programme. He had initiated a talent PhD, and I got quite fortunate because that had just started at a time when there wasn't much else going on like it, and I was quite new into the role. We had a really smart guy who was running the PhD, actually, who's now performance director at GB Hockey. And through some of the things that he was trying to unpick through the PhD, and the aim of it was to try and, I guess, assess the validity of things like scouting, try and see if there was any validity in talent testing, which is probably, for want of a better description, a bit like NFL combine type testing. And he also wanted to look into performance statistics in a slightly more unconventional way. So there were a number of things that came out of that PhD that myself, him, and a few others just tried to apply quite quickly. And again, I felt quite fortunate that we had that going on because there was a number of things that came out of that I wouldn't have otherwise learned. So I guess I took a little bit of responsibility for trying to embed some of those things with a few others as early as possible. And that kind of then evolved and grew, a lot of trial and error, a lot of mistakes, but we settled on a bit of a formula for something that I think has been quite effective. And then in 2016, we had a new director of cricket, Andrew Strauss, who came in and he asked me to extend some of that insight and intelligence further up the pathway to our Lions programme. So it officially became half of my role in 2016. And then literally a year later, I got asked to extend that even further up to the England team, and it became my full-time role, and I gave up some of my programme management responsibilities. So as of 2017, for the last couple of years, I've concentrated on talent ID or player identification for the men's pathway for that whole period. The reason I share that is obviously I think it's probably hopefully quite useful for the room to see how we've got to that stage as a bit of background. But from a cricketing perspective, I guess we've been picking cricket teams for over 100 years, but that responsibilities always lay with the captain. And it's only very recently that some of that's evolved and changed if you look at our evolution. So in my opinion, the systematic talent identification and selection is still quite embryonic and quite new. I think there's a lot we could learn from other sports as we've tried to do. And there aren't that many equivalents. So I've not been able to learn necessarily off of the guys in our county or domestic structure, and there aren't that many international equivalents either. So in some ways that's been quite challenging, in other ways that's been quite refreshing because I haven't stepped on anyone's toes, been able to be quite creative, so I think that's been quite good. The other reason I share a bit of that history is a couple of things really. Firstly, and I mentioned it with a PhD, I feel quite fortunate that much of what we've done in this space has been underpinned by scientific rigour, and I've not had to do that work, somebody else has. So again, it's been quite good from my perspective. And the second reason I share that is it's a good example of, I think, good practice or sort of hopefully best practice emerging from the bottom of the pathway and working its way up, which I think is quite rare. Normally in international sport you get something impressive or best practice happening at the top of the pathway, and then it eventually sort of feeds its way down and people adapt it and it sort of gets applied to talent. We actually went the other way around, and again I was quite fortunate in that we were able to do a lot of trial and error, make a lot of mistakes. We didn't really have the glare or the pressure of the media for some of the things we were doing, so actually that meant that we could settle on a few processes and a few activities that then by the time they made their way up to England they were a bit more established. So again, that might be a lesson to, I guess, a lot of us really, that if we're trying to manage a change process, maybe it feels quite obvious to start at the bit that feels most impactful, which is the sharp end. Maybe starting somewhere else and working your way up might be a safer way to do it. The title of this presentation was centred around a model of rational thinking for an emotional process. And I'm going to kind of add to that context a little bit by showing a short video. I'll apologise in advance, Sandra, for this video.
I'm not sure anyone at the moment has got a steady heart. 15 from 6. He is so feeling it. Boundaries are so important. On the money, but it's out of the ground, is it? Is it out of the ground? It is! It is! Williamson, a wry smile. Goes again. This is a big moment. They've got to run. They go to the other end. Oh, he gets in the way. This has got to go all the way to the boundary off the bat. Can you believe this? I do not believe what I've just seen. Down the ground. Now then, they've got to try and come back. Santner throws it in. Out. Rashid is out. 7 weeks of cricket, 48 games, 1 ball. Here's Bolt. They're going to push. Are we in for a super over? They've got to go quick. They've got to go quick. Out. I'm sure he's out. We're going to a super over.
You are kidding me. You are kidding me. After 7 weeks, we are not done yet.
Here we go. 3 off the first. Gap, is it? Yes, it is. They've got 8 off 3. He gets it in a gap. He gets a boundary. And New Zealand's target in 6 deliveries is 16 to be the world champion. So on a young man. It's a big call. 3 off 1, New Zealand. Ah, he's got it! It's huge! It's gone! It's out of the park! Boom! 7 from 4 now! pressure. It's getting to everybody. This is the moment. It's Archer to Guptill. 2 to win. Guptill's going to push for 2. They've got to go. It's got to throw. It's got to go to the keeper's end.
England down and out.
One of the lowest points in English history. Remember the name.
He's got it. England have won the World Cup by the barest of margins. By the barest of all margins. Absolute ecstasy for England. Agony. Agony for New Zealand.
What a way to end the game. Truly remarkable scenes.
ICC World Cup champions, England!
I'm actually quite pleased that video works. I've watched it that many times, it's at risk of wearing itself out. So, I guess a couple of things there. And for me, what's significant about that video is whilst I'm definitely an advocate of an objective and a data-driven approach to decision-making, which is the essence of my presentation, the reason why I think that's quite a good video is it's a microcosm of everything that's complex about sport. The emotion itself, you know, if you think about us as decision-makers who were involved in picking the World Cup squad and everything that went with it, you know, we made a mess of our group stage and actually left ourselves needing to win 4 games on the bounce against 3 of the best teams in the world. And you know, that was my first experience of having been in that position. And I remember quite a lot how difficult that was from a decision-making perspective, and also how you just digest everything that's around you. That was quite tricky. But also when you look at what the players went through there's a huge amount of emotion and pressure. And some of the presentations yesterday, you know, particularly the stuff around mindset, it certainly resonated when you look at, you know, when the panel were talking, when you look at what players go through in that environment, there's a huge amount of emotion for everybody involved. So going back to what I'm going to present on today, having processes that have rigor, that underpin what you do, just help you to navigate through those moments. Even in terms of the way the players performed. So someone like Ben Stokes there just decided in the heat of probably the toughest moment that he's ever experienced to get down on one knee and start sweeping left-arm fast bowlers, which by all accounts is something that he's never done in practice or never done in a game before. How do you predict that? There's no data that could tell you that that's going to happen. You know, you haven't seen that happen before. So, you know, again, Jofra Archer bowling at the end for us, he's never been in that position before. So there's a number of unknowns that data just won't give you. So I guess, you know, at the outset, one of the key points I'd like to make, that our approach to talent identification has been harnessing the art and the science that underpins those sorts of decisions, and trying to make smart decisions through the complexity that is sport. And that, you know, that's the thing that we love about sport. So, you know, I guess in a conference where we've talked quite a lot about data and analytics and objectivity, and I'm going to continue doing that, I'd say the challenge that I've set ourselves and everybody else would be that we try and make sure that we can balance the subjectivity, the objectivity, the art, the science, the complexity, and try and make those smart decisions through those emotions. And I'll try and bring that to life now. Marcus touched on this earlier, but my responsibility, you know, from a strategic perspective, has been ensuring that the right quantity and quality of players have been selected onto our pathway programs into the England team, and that's centred around 5 key sort of activity areas. So my responsibilities could be summed up by these 5 icons, really. I'll very briefly talk through each one just to try and bring it to life. So my main responsibility has been overseeing our scouting network. So that involves deploying and managing about 25 scouts across our men's pathway. They're part-time consultant scouts across the various levels. And I guess, you know, without stating the obvious, they observe domestic cricket and they act as information providers for our selectors and our decision makers. Clearly through that, I also am responsible for all of our scout meetings whenever we get together to discuss players. And even my approach to those has evolved over the last few years, and I think we've got to a point now where we run quite effective scout meetings, actually. I'm also responsible for training and developing all of those scouts, which I'd like to do a little bit more of. It's probably more of a resourcing thing, but we do enough so that hopefully our scouts evolve through their roles as well. From an analysis perspective, I'm not specifically responsible for performance analysis. We've got a head of performance analysis who does that. But I guess my role is directing performance analysis when it comes to anything that's ID and selection. So that could be how we analyse our scouting data and our trends. It could be our performance data and our match data that we have. It could be overseeing any of the research that we sort of deliver. And I mentioned earlier a talent PhD. We've had two cycles and 2 phases of that talent PhD, which has been really interesting for us, and I'll share some of the stuff that's come out of that. And then also more recently doing some work to align and enhance some of our digital systems. So coming back to SmarterBase, we use SmarterBase for scouting. We've had a relationship with Fusion Sport for quite a long time now, as Marcus said, but the main thing we use it for is for our scouting. But we're doing a piece of work at the minute that's trying to align and enhance some of that, which I'll talk about later. From a selection perspective, it's fair to say that I'm a non-decision maker, so I sit in on selection at every level of the men's pathway. I'm the only person that does, and I think that's quite useful because it just enables a little bit of consistency in terms of approach and also a bit of sharing of information. But I do that as a non-decision maker, which is quite a nice position to be in because it's not really my neck on the line most of the time. In terms of what that actually involves, so I support our selection strategy, so making sure that we are prioritising some of our short-term needs, but also got an eye on our medium to long-term priorities and objectives. It's my job to make sure that selectors are well-informed, is probably the simplest way of putting it. So whether it's scouting data, whether it's coaches' insights, medical information, video packages, psychological profiles, whatever it might be, it's my job to try and make sure that when the selectors go into decision-making, they're as well-informed as they can be. And that's an exciting challenge. It's also my responsibility to try and check and challenge process because I'm not invested as much as the others in the decision-making because it's not my call to make. Hopefully I can have more of a helicopter view on the way we're running our meetings and the process that we go through, minimising things like conformity, groupthink and biases. And then finally, with regards to selection, it's my job to try and provide pathway options. When we've had players who've been on our under-19s or our Lions, there's a huge amount of intelligence within our pathway, and hopefully I can hold some of that and pass that on to the rest of our pathway. And then, I guess from an assessment perspective, I'd probably describe this as talent confirmation. So this is an area where we've made a bit of progress recently, but I think we've still got quite a lot to do. For me, this is just simply trying to combine talent identification with talent development so that it's more of a cyclical process, rather than identifying and recruiting your players and then getting them through the door and then all your coaches start again, which is probably what we were doing a few years ago. So just trying to tie those bits of information together. And then, I guess, making sure that we're observing and assessing our players whenever they're in best v best environments. So when they're training and competing at regional level, or if they're competing at international age group or Lions level, that's really important for us to have a view of how those players are performing in those environments, because that's probably the closest they're going to get to when they eventually debut for England. And then when it comes to sharing and engaging, this is a bigger piece of work and this takes a huge amount of time and effort. But there's a number of things we do to share and engage with our networks. We have 18 professional counties and they all have their own academies as well. So one of the key things that I do in terms of sharing and engaging is a nominations process. As an international pathway, we can benefit from nominations from our counties. So working quite closely and having discussions about players with counties is really important. And I suppose other areas that I share engaging is sharing good practice with the rest of the game. I deliver on our coach development pathway, so our level 3 and 4 coaching programs. And then also more recently, trying to do some work with all of our counties to try and enhance the infrastructure and sophistication of scouting, performance data, and talent ID and digital systems in our county game. And I think we've got a bit of work to do in that area, but in the next sort of 6 to 9 months, I think we're going to make some real progress. For the next sort of 15 to 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try and share some tips. So I've got sort of 3 slides, 3 tips that I'm going to try and share that I think have been lessons that we've learned. And each one of those, there's a few pointers that I'll try and explain a little bit further and expand on that centre around the theme of this presentation. I guess my first tip would be that the importance of thinking longitudinally, and I think this came up yesterday with the guys from New South Wales who presented. And I guess from my perspective, one of the first lessons that I learned, and again, it was one of those fortunate lessons, that it's really important to start with the end in mind. So when I talk about our scouting data and the way that we capture scouting information from a sort of SmarterBase perspective, I mentioned that PhD right at the beginning, and the purpose of that PhD was as I discussed. But what we tried to set out to do at that stage was a systematic rating or assessment of players by multiple people done independently. And eventually we adapted that and moulded that to help us pick cricket teams. If we'd have started out with the intention to try and do something that helps us pick cricket teams, I don't think we'd have designed our forms and our reporting in exactly the same way, and I think that would have been to our detriment. So again, if I could give any advice, I'd encourage you when you're trying to capture data and you're putting together forms on Smarterbase or whatever, particularly when you're doing, independent subjective ratings on players, try and think about how you're going to use it. So what might this look like when you get to presenting your data? How might it influence decision making? Because some of the gains that we've had longitudinally have been because it was set out to not just pick cricket teams, it was set out as a research study, and therefore it's helped us quite significantly. With that in mind, I think it's really important that if you're getting people to assess and rate players, try and force them to repeatedly make judgments on players. And it's quite interesting, actually, that all of us, I guess, who work in sport, we're very quick to judge our athletes or our players. But as soon as you ask someone to actually write it down or to stick it on a form or to do it officially, people get quite nervous about it because they think all of a sudden it's going to lead to decisions. And so somehow you've got to create a little bit of safety, and you've got to try and encourage people to actually make judgments and do it quite frequently. Because if you start with the end in mind and you make those judgments and you track those over a period of time, you can learn stuff when you look back. And that kind of feeds into the next few points I'm going to make, and I'll share some examples of some of the things we've learned. So we've been systematically scouting players using Smarterbase since around 2011 or 12. So guys who were sort of 15 and 16 at that stage are now sort of early to mid-20s, many of which have gone on and some of them have played for England, some of them, many have played for the Lions team. And we've been asking our scouts to make those judgments over quite a long period of time. So only recently we're able to look back and actually go, well, how good are we at predicting? I've been asking my scouts to make predictions about players. How good are we at predicting? Is scouting even worthwhile? We've been able to find that actually our scouts were able to predict, with 15 and 16-year-olds, they predicted Lions' debut with 80% accuracy, which I think is pretty impressive. I don't think there's that many predictive industries where you'd get an 80% predictive accuracy. So from our perspective, that was quite a good pat on the back to say, well, this is a worthwhile endeavour. Let's just keep investing in it. And actually, when you're dealing with 15 and 16-year-olds, when we've also proved that performance data can be quite noisy and not particularly predictive, it probably tells us that you're better off trusting your scouts and your experts than you are the runs and wickets they're getting at 15 or 16. So that was quite an interesting finding for us, and we only did that because of those first couple of points, where we started with the end in mind and we made a lot of judgments and we did it for a long period of time. 7 or 8 years later, look back and all of a sudden you learn something. I guess connected to that, if you think about that same group of players, so those 15 and 16-year-olds who we've been assessing over this long period of time, they've now gone on and, as I said, represented the Lions or England. What we've been able to do is look at those that have gone on and done well so far versus those that haven't gone on and done so well so far, and we'll try to work out, well, which things discriminate between them. So guys like, for those of you who follow cricket and follow the England team, guys like Sam Curran, Ollie Pope, Dominic Bess, we've got Mason Crane, Haseeb Hameed, Saqib Mahmood. There's a number of guys there who have debuted quite early in the England team now or have been recently. It's almost looking at what commonalities do those guys have that discriminates them from those who haven't gone on. And through that, it gives you an indication of maybe some predictive indicators. Now, we've done that sort of in a cross-sectional perspective a few times. We've done that longitudinally as well. And each time we've done it, various things emerge from our scouting data. So one good example would be, almost probably every time that we've done that type of longitudinal analysis, our scout psychological rating of a player's inner drive has come up almost every time as a discriminator between those groups. So looking at that, you could probably conclude that the players that have gone on and done well display higher levels of inner drive based on what our scouts think than those that haven't gone on. Now, I always give a couple of sort of health warnings with that. If you're assuming you're picking the right players, that tells you that inner drive is probably quite an important factor for players to go on to the highest level, which fits intuitively with much of what we know. But it also tells us that it could be predictive. If you're not picking the right players, it just tells you that you're picking lads who work quite hard. So either way, it's quite useful because it might give you an insight into some of your biases and flaws, but it might also give you something predictive. So whichever way you sort of conclude and use that is quite helpful. And again, we've only been able to do that because we've been tracking back through the data and we've been looking at that longitudinally. And I guess we centre quite a lot on players and athletes. The other thing that's been really useful from my perspective has been that I've been able to provide some really good feedback to my scouts. So, over the last couple of years, we've done some CPD sessions with my scouts where I've asked them to reflect themselves on, when they're scouting a player, given all the scouting criteria that we've got, which things do they think are their preferences that they lean towards when they're judging players? And once they've done that sort of self-reflection piece, I've then been able to give them actual evidence of what their preferences and biases are. So every time they say yes to a player, what features of the scouting report form significantly influence their yes? And equally, when they say no to a player, which things influence their no's? And we've been able to do that to sort of, I guess, 95% strength in terms of looking at that. So for a scout to actually get a report of, well, these are the things that I score particularly highly whenever I say yes, and those that score highly when I say no is really, really interesting. And even from a personal perspective, I don't actually scout so much now, but I used to. And I remember the first time I did that, whenever I was saying yes to a batsman, it was a batsman who was quite defensive and quite technically proficient. And that's probably because that's the way I used to play my cricket. So I was just looking for the types of players that embodied the way I approached my own game. But only by actually seeing that evidence did it open my eyes. So by following, I guess, these steps and doing things with the end in mind, tracking it over a long period of time, repeatedly forcing people to make judgments, and then looking back at that data, we can give our scouts actual feedback of their biases rather than making assumptions. So the second tip that I'm going to go to centres around this whole debate, I guess, around objectivity and subjectivity. And I'll kind of explain this a little bit more to a degree, in that we often spend quite a lot of time considering the value of objective information sources versus subjective. And I don't think it's particularly helpful to look at them as binary things. I prefer to consider them as a continuum. And I think there's a huge amount of value, as I said earlier when I showed the video, in understanding subjective assessment of talent and players. And what you should try to do, I guess, is try and move that along the continuum and make it a bit more objective. So in my former life as a teacher, I remember marking pieces of coursework, as many teachers would do. Marking an essay or a piece of coursework is quite a subjective endeavour, actually. You're reading a piece of work and you're making an assessment of it. Well, how does education make that a bit more objective? Well, every teacher has a mark scheme, so they've got a reference point or a template. That's probably been standardised nationally. Once you've done your marking, your head of department will probably verify that internally and look at a sample. And then actually there'll be an external moderation and a verification as well. So they're good examples of how something that started off quite subjective starts moving along the continuum and becomes a bit more objective. And I guess we've tried to embrace that, pretty much with everything that we've done. So coming back to our PhD, one of the key findings that came out of the first PhD was the significance of using multiple eyes multiple times. So scouting was only really valid and reliable if you did it in that way. Sounds quite obvious, one person seeing something once is far less useful than lots of people seeing things lots of times. But it's funny how often we don't do that. And obviously I'd like to emphasise the importance of aggregating that insight. And one of the key things and strengths that we've got from SmarterBase from a scouting perspective is we've systematically asked questions about our players. We've stored that information for quite a long period of time. Through the dashboard function, we've been able to aggregate quite well. And it gives us, at any given time, as someone leading the process, myself and the selectors can get an aggregated view of what our scouts think about players for any particular window of time. And that's massively helpful for us. So, I can't stress that enough, really, the importance of aggregating multiple eyes multiple times when you're trying to assess talent. I guess a second thing that's really important from a subjectivity perspective is trying to understand players holistically. This came up again yesterday, I think, particularly with the panel, I think, that we're talking. If I was going to be provocative, what we typically do is, certainly in cricket, is we pick players based on something technical or physical that catches our eye. Either a really nice-looking cover drive or somebody bowling extremely fast or hitting the ball out the ground. It's those things that catch your eye from a talent ID perspective. And then what we end up doing is deselecting and dropping players because of their character, or they don't work hard enough, or not quite mentally tough enough. And I guess from my perspective, it's trying to shift that so we capture as much information about players as early as possible and try and have that holistic profile on our players, then it gives us the best chance of not making those sort of decision-making mistakes. So what does that mean for us? From a scouting perspective, all of our scouts are asked to assess players in a sort of holistic way. But also, when it comes to selection and decision-making, a bit like I said earlier, it's my job to try and make sure that the selectors are armed with scouting data, performance statistics, video footage, coaching insight, science and medicine info, whatever it will be, and trying to get that for as long as possible from as many sources as possible. And then going back to, I guess, referencing the sort of data analytics bits of it, some of the stuff that the guys from New South Wales Institute mentioned yesterday, our model for that is our scouting data sits currently on SmarterBase, but actually many of those other information sources exist somewhere else. And we've taken the approach of trying to make sure we've got the right application for the right problem that we're trying to solve, like you guys said yesterday. And we just have all of our data feeding into what we've called our data lake. And we're now building our own apps, and those apps are enabling us to surface our information and use it and digest it however we want to. So much of what you guys said yesterday resonated, and I'm by no means a tech expert, but some of the guys, sort of at HQ have sort of talked us through that process, and it's been really beneficial. I guess my next point regarding this subjectivity versus sort of objectivity debate is having real role clarity around who your information providers are and who your decision makers are. And in the past, that's often been quite blurred. But from my perspective, where we've got a bit of clarity now is for our whole pathway. So the England team, the Lions, and the under-19s, we've got a consistent selection structure. So we have a 3-man decision-making forum at all of those levels. So we've got 2 independent selectors, and then we've got the third person, who's the head coach. And those 3 people, I guess, share the decision-making responsibilities. Many people often ask, well, why is that the case? Why doesn't the head coach just pick the cricket team like they do in other sports? And for me, quite an obvious reason that one of the key things a coach needs to do is build effective relationships with players to impact performance and development. It's quite difficult to do that when you're the only person responsible for picking or dropping players. So from us, it feels like a more rigorous approach to have that panel. But we've got real role clarity around what our selectors do. And from a scouting perspective, or even our coaches, our skills coaches and our science and medicine staff, they're all information providers. And emphasising that from our scouting perspective, it just makes them feel a little bit safer about offering their judgments. Giving them real clarity that it's their job to provide an opinion, and we're really interested in their opinion and judgment. And actually then it's hand that over to the decision makers. I guess my next point would be the significance of, from what I would call, having data on tap as opposed to data on top. We've heard quite a lot around the significance of using this type of objective information to make decisions, and I've touched on it quite a few times. From my perspective, you get the most out of your data when you repeatedly ask a lot of questions, and then you use your data to either prove or disprove what you might be finding, and having almost like an iterative process to your analysis. And that's something that I think we've tried to do quite well. So generating as many different hypotheses as possible, and then using your data to try and prove or disprove what you think might be going on with a player, and then hopefully using that to inform decision making. For me, that feels like a far smarter way than just collecting data for the sake of collecting data and then not really doing anything with it. And my final point regarding this is I guess, trying wherever possible to minimise conformity and groupthink. And there's a lot of talk around biases when it comes to talent ID, and actually when you've got guys in a group and you've got the potential for individual biases to run into bandwagon thinking and shared thinking and conformity, you multiply the negative impact of some of those biases. So we've done quite a few things to try and minimise that. So even from a selection perspective, it's quite common that I will ask selectors to pick their teams totally independently. So you imagine if this week was a scouting forum, if this week was a selection week, we would have a scouting forum or a get-together at the start of the week, and I would ask our information providers to provide their judgments, and the selectors would hear all of that. Immediately after that, I'd probably at times ask the selectors not to talk to each other too much and to just do their own reflective thinking. And they might then submit their teams into me independently. And then when we get together to select, the purpose of that meeting is to debate. And when you frame things like that, it just means that you minimise some of the groupthink that could happen. So that's just one example of how we sometimes approach selection, particularly at the younger elements of the pathway. My final tip is the importance of harnessing expertise and intuition. And probably from the 3 tips I've given, I'd say this one's probably the most important, and it sits at the heart of what I think Simon mentioned yesterday, when he talked about the importance of the human element. And the reality is, unless you do this bit well, unless you use your experts, unless you do things that are quite intuitive, you're just going to be on your own and you're not going to take people with you. So you're probably not going to influence decision making. So I mentioned earlier that we use our county network quite a lot to influence who we're going to look at. If we looked at our 18 counties and all the players that are on our academies, for an example, there's quite a big group of players. We don't have the resource to systematically scout in detail all of those players. So it makes sense for us to start by asking all of our counties for some clarity on who they think, objectively, who they think are the guys that could go on. Now, we can do that as a national pathway, and if we weren't a national pathway, that'd be a little bit trickier. But the key thing is knowing who your information providers are, and if you can rely on nominations that could be powerful and trustworthy, I think it's a good idea to use them, because it means you can be a bit more efficient with your resources. without stating the obvious, it's also really important to appreciate age and stage of development. So from our perspective, I talk about scouting at each of those levels. The questions we ask about our players are very different at those levels. At England level, many of the scouting questions that we would ask centre quite strongly on England's game plan, how England are trying to play their cricket. There's also some element to some of the foundations of the game, but in essence, it's around what's this player's current readiness to play for England. When we're talking at Lions or young Lions or under-19 level, I don't really ask any of those questions of our scouts because actually the game plan's relatively irrelevant. Assessing a player who's 16 or 17 about whether he could fulfil England's current game plan doesn't make any sense because in 5 years' time, the game plan's changed. So actually we centre a little bit more at the younger ages on the real foundations of the game, the things that aren't as easy to coach. They're the things that we've got to look for when we're identifying there. And we've got a bit of work to do to clarify that and get a bit cleaner with it, but I think we're in a reasonable place. It also, I guess, comes back to the types of questions that you then ask, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think what you're trying to do from a scouting perspective is trying to capture and use gut feel. So, we had a presentation yesterday about machine learning and AI, and clearly that was all really fascinating. And we're trying to explore equivalent things like that through ball tracking. But I often think it's really important as well that your scouts who have got a lot of wisdom, have watched a lot of cricket, they're doing a process of pattern recognition every time they look at players. So there's an example of some machine learning going on there. Yes, it might be rigged with some flaws and some biases to a degree, but actually, if you approach it from a perspective of aggregating multiple eyes multiple times, you can really capture that gut feel. So again, I'd encourage you, if you're working with scouts, to try and go on a journey with your scouts and your selectors and your coaches, try and get to the heart of what they think is really important about talent, and then ask them questions about it repeatedly. So that's, again, something we've tried to do. And that was really important because it helped me get buy-in. I remember the first time I tried to get people to move from just watching cricket or, at best, writing out a report form on a Word document, and I asked them to do things a bit more systematically. The immediate questions were, well, why do we need to even do this? I know what I'm looking for is the thing that often comes back. And I just kept saying, well, you might know what you're looking for, but we don't collectively. So it's important that we can capture your gut feel, share that with everybody else, and we can all benefit from it. With all of that in mind, it gives you the option to be really precise with your questions. And for me, one of the real strengths about SmarterBase has been you can actually structure your questions very differently. So I will deliberately ask a question in a multiple choice format where I want to do that. At times I'll provide scales. Other times I'll deliberately ask a yes-no binary question. So when I'm asking for judgments, at times I'll push people for it to be a yes or no. There's other times where you want a little bit more depth, where you might ask a question where they can type things into a text box. Whatever it is, but again, I wouldn't underestimate the significance of using the right question format to capture assessments on players, because you've got to have that end in mind and know how you're going to use it. And that's really helped us use some of the data that's captured in a really insightful way. And I guess one specific example of that is when I ask my scouts to rate players, I think it's important to give them an appropriate reference point. So, many of the scouting forms I've seen across a number of sports in the UK, typically when they ask questions about players, they'll use, if they're using a scale, they'll use either a qualitative scale or a frequency scale. So it could be a 1 to 10, with number 1 being not very good and 10 being really good, or even a 1 to 5. Or it could be, and that's a good example of a qualitative scale. It could be a frequency scale where number 1 is you don't see something very often, but number 10 you see it loads of times. Look, both of those are very useful scales, and if you aggregate that, you'll get some interesting information. But what it isn't is intuitive. A scout or a coach doesn't watch a performer and go, well, what's that? Is that a 7 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10? Our brains don't work like that. What we typically do is what I mentioned earlier, is pattern recognition. So what my scouts are typically doing when they're watching a performer is they're looking at what they're doing and they're thinking, how does that compare to what I think good looks like in my head based on all of my years of experience, or what I expect at this level? Or they're comparing the players to the people around them at that level. So if that's the case, we'll give them a scale that reflects that. So probably, I'd say at least 70% of the questions that I ask on my scouting report forms use a peer scale. And I ask them to rate the players relative to their peers. And so long as you've got clarity around your definition of peers, it gives you really good standardization, and it enables you to do the longitudinal stuff. Because we want to be picking guys that are very good or outstanding compared to their peers for as long as possible. And they're the guys that we're really interested in. And I think that's far more useful than just looking at sort of qualitative or frequency scales. So that's really helped us. So I guess in summary for my tips, there were those three areas that I think are really important. Thinking longitudinally, balancing subjectivity and objectivity, and really harnessing expertise and intuition. Just to finish, there's a couple of areas that I'll kind of summarise on. And this next slide or this graphic gives a bit of a feel for what we've done over the last few years, and in particular, this was 2018. I share this for a number of reasons. One, it kind of brings to life some of the things that I've said that I've been responsible for, but also, there's areas of this that I'm really happy with and proud of, and there's other areas I think we've got some significant amount of work to do. But I guess the big take-home message from my perspective is that there's 2 or 3 years ago, almost all of this didn't exist. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in a short space of time. A few summaries, really, and things that I'll cover here. We've scouted, so this is data, as I said, from 2018. We scouted formally in excess of over 200 players and submitted, 1,200 scouting reports. So we did a good job of achieving our multiple eyes multiple times. From a selection perspective, we actually picked 26 squads over the course of that year across those different levels. Now, they're squads, not teams. If you pick teams, then you could probably triple that number. But the reason I share that is it shows the significance of what you're doing. If you're going to plan for selection, you're going to deliver selection in a rigorous way. If you're going to review it, if you're going to communicate with players and counties and the media effectively, that's quite a lot of work. Well, we've got a major selection point every 2 weeks based on those numbers. So there's a huge amount of energy that needs to go into that. So again, from our perspective, it was a case of starting to take that a little bit more seriously. From an analysis perspective, some of those numbers are quite pleasing. So 73% of our England debutants in 2018 had played for both the under-19s and the Lions, and that feels like quite a healthy number for me. If that was 100%, I'd be a little bit concerned because you'd be thinking that's quite a linear sort of closed shop in terms of our ID and selection. But actually, it's not 50% and it's not us wasting investment. 73% feels about right. We've also had, in 2018, we had 4 test debutants under the age of 20, which is quite rare for English cricket. We probably I don't think in the history of English cricket we've picked 4 lads under the age of 20 in the same year. We've probably only ever done that a couple of times in a year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing a good job, but what it does tell us is that we've got conviction in our predictions a little bit earlier. And actually some of the guys we've picked have done quite well. And that's us benefiting from that holistic profile of the players. Some of the longitudinal stuff we've done has come from, for those of you who kind of understand some of this as an example, we've used a Bayesian analysis, which has been quite useful for us to understand, I guess, previous behaviour and able to predict future. And then, looking at things like assessment, we've implemented some very specific England readiness processes. So the guys closest to England, we've started to get a little bit more precise in how we assess players. And the two things we're often balancing at that level are current readiness and future potential. And some of the work we've done there has been really impressive. And then, I guess finally, from a sharing and engaging perspective, we've had 100% of our county nominations have come in for all of our levels. So it just shows good engagement with our counties. And it shows that we're using our information providers around us. So as I said, there's some stuff there that I'm really happy with and pleased with. There's some areas that I think we've got some work to do still. Just finally, really, and I suppose this is a good place to finish, and it comes back to the title of this presentation and also the video that I showed and everything that I've tried to explain. That in a world or an industry where we're all looking for the answer, or we're looking for, I guess, a magic solution or even a silver bullet, the reality, as many of us know, is those things don't exist. And from our learning, the most durable results have stemmed from prolonged sound decision making. And actually being able to make those decisions through the complexity of sport, through the emotion, through the uncertainty. And that's the thing that we centre on. So, I saw this quote a couple of weeks ago and I thought it would be quite a nice place to finish the presentation. So that's pretty much it from me. So I guess the key takeaway message would be some of the journey we've been on. Certainly those 3 tips, and hopefully there's some useful stuff in there for all of you. But also balancing, as I said from the outset, really, of trying to make objective and robust and rigorous decisions through what can be quite an emotional process.